a Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello, it's Matt, and welcome to another episode of Living History. I'm actually coming to you from Paris, and I've just finished a tour of the Western Front, my signature tour of the Western Front, and I thought what a great opportunity to just tell you a little bit about that tour and what a fantastic time I've had walking the battlefields of the Western Front. It's such a special place. It was the place where my history career really started. I've been basically obsessed with the Western Front since I was a teenager, and I never tire of getting over there, walking the ground and learning the stories of the Anzac. So thanks for your patience while I've been off the air for a few weeks. It's with good reason, because I've been on the battlefields. And so now it's great to be back and sharing these stories about the Western Front. If you haven't been to the Western Front, you really should go. It's just such an extraordinary place. And when I say the Western Front, I mean, from an Australian perspective, the First World War battlefields of northern France and Belgium, where the Australians fought between 1916 and 1918. So I always say that Gallipoli absolutely deserves its place as our iconic first battle of the Great War and one of the most important battles Australians have fought in. But most of the heavy lifting that we did, our great contribution to the Great War, was done on the Western Front. It was done in places like the Somme and the Ypres salient and at Bullecourt and Fromelles and all these iconic places. The mud of Passchendaele. I mean, there's just so many iconic places on the Western Front to explore, and it's just such an extraordinary story. So I wanted to take a few minutes just to tell you a little bit about my travels, hopefully get you inspired to head over there one day and walk the ground, because every Australian listening to this really should one day. It's just such an extraordinary place. So the tour I've just come back from is actually the only tour of the Western Front that I lead, one of the only tours I lead for the whole year. It's the McLachlan signature tour, and it's just a really great experience. The reason I do this tour is when I started the company in 2007, when I started McLachlan Battlefield Tours. I used to lead our Anzac Day tour. I started in 2008 with our first tour by leading 30 people around the battlefields for Anzac Day, and that was the first time I did it. And we went from there, and as the company grew, it got to the stage where we were doing multiple coaches, usually 3 or 4 coaches for Anzac Day, and I was leading the first coach. But I just got to the point where I realised that I had a lot of talented historians who were doing great work, and that my time was probably better spent doing things like this, promoting history and talking about history and not actually on the ground. That all changed a few years ago, though. I actually really missed the touring. I wanted to get back over there, that interaction with passengers, walking the ground and revealing these stories to people for the first time. It always makes me think of when I went to the battlefields for the first time about 25 years ago, and the experiences I had actually seeing these sites I'd read so much about and heard so much about, and learning about these new experiences of the Anzacs, that I wanted to share that with other people, and I missed not having that experience. And so we launched the McLachlan Signature Tour, which is the only tour I lead personally, and it's a really great experience. And because it's a bit of a special tour, we go to places that we would normally go to. If there's anywhere I'm really interested in going that I haven't been to, we try and include that on the tour. So the tour is different every year. We've had lots of people that have come on every tour that we've done it since 2019. And just a really great experience. We started in Paris. We headed up to the battlefields of the Ypres salient, an absolutely favourite place of mine in Belgium, the town of Ypres, known as Wipers to the troops. And we spent a few days up there exploring the battlefields of the salient and catching up with some dear friends and really telling the stories of the Anzacs in 1917. And then we headed down via the very moving battlefields of Fromelles and Bullecourt down to the Somme battlefields, where we spent another few days telling the stories of 1916 and 1918 in the Somme region. And it's, a pretty special area. The Somme, it goes without saying, most famous for the battles of 1916, but also we should never overlook the battles of 1918 that occurred in that region, where Australia, I think, did some of our greatest work in our military history. I think 1918, I'm going to go on the record and say it, I think 1918 is our most important military year. I think we did more in 1918 than in any other year in our military history. It was the only time in our history where we were the main army on the main battlefield fighting the main enemy of the war. And I think we overlook our huge achievements in 1918 It's a controversial statement to say it's our most important military year, and if you disagree, certainly feel free to contact me and give me your opinion, because I know lots of people would disagree. You'd think 42 would probably rate pretty highly as well, but I'm gonna stick to my guns and say 1918 was our most important year. And on this tour, we got to explore the full story of 1918, not just in the Somme region, but also in the Aisne region, which is further east from the Somme and was where the Australians advanced later in the war, really late in 1918, pushing the Germans back day after day. And there's some very special battlefields in that region. And we went even to the 4th Division Memorial at the town of Bellingleys. It's a very isolated spot that most people never get to because it's way in the east, not in the main battlefield area. And the 4th Division put their memorial there, the Australian 4th Division, that is, because they wanted to say that they'd fought all the way across the Western Front from 1916 all the way to the end of 1918. So it was just a really special experience. I love it. I love going there. A shout out to anyone who was on the tour. Jaden, I know you're a listener of the podcast, so shout out to you, mate. It was great getting to know you on the tour, and all the other people that came on the tour. And also people who've been on previous tours with me, or all those people who are thinking about going on a tour in the future. I'd love to see you over there. And it's my favourite part of my job is walking that ground and telling these stories and revealing the stories to people for the first time. And let's not forget, I was joined, of course, by my wonderful friend and historian Pete Smith. So we told these stories together, and we've really become a good team, Pete and I, walking the ground. If you've heard our Battle Walks podcast, you'll know that we enjoy a bit of banter, and we really bounce off each other very, very well. We both contribute different things to the story, and I think having both of us there on the ground, you get a much fuller description of what went on and some interesting insights. And we had some great conversations. I really enjoyed sitting down with the passengers and sometimes challenging accepted opinions about generals and about Monash and about the role of the Australians in the war, but also hearing their stories and about their families. A lot of people on the tour were following in the footsteps of a family member. Oh, which reminds me, I've got to tell you about the most amazing story. I've got a list here of things I want to talk about, and I forgot to put this one on it. But this would probably rate as one of the most amazing things that's happened to me on a battlefield. So as part of the tour, we go to cemeteries to visit relatives of the people on the tour, if the cemetery is within distance of the tour. I mean, there's more than 900 cemeteries, so there's obviously a lot, and they're scattered all over the countryside of France and Belgium. But if they're in the tour area, we will do our best to go there and visit graves of people, of family members of people on the tour. And we had someone who wanted to go to Jeancourt Cemetery, which is quite a distance in the east, a 1918 battlefield of the Australians. Not uncommon to have Australians buried in this area, just because it's a pretty common place that Australians were killed. Casualties were very high in this region in 1918, so a pretty common place. So we were heading to Jeancourt Cemetery to visit the grave of a relative of one of the people on the tour. And then the most extraordinary coincidence occurred. Probably the most extraordinary coincidence of this type I've ever seen. And I think Pete Smith, our historian who leads tours every day, had never seen anything like this either. It turned out we had not one person who had someone killed, a relative buried in that cemetery, but we had two people on the tour. But here's the coincidence. Both killed on the same day and both serving in the same battalion. So almost certainly they would have known each other, these two men. And they were killed on the same day and are both buried in the cemetery together. It was absolutely extraordinary. The people on the tour did not know each other. They'd never met before. They didn't know each other. It was just one of those extraordinary things where, for incredible coincidence, that two people, there's only 30 people on the tour, and so to have two of them with a relative killed on the same day from the same battalion, buried in the same cemetery, was really quite extraordinary. And so we went and paid our respects at those graves, and it was very emotional for everyone on the tour. But the cemetery itself was really quite extraordinary. And it's what I love about walking the battlefields is you're always learning new things. But how can I put this? The battlefields are always telling a story. And this cemetery told quite an interesting story, in addition to the amazing coincidence of the people on the tour. So I have been to this cemetery before, but only very briefly, and I hadn't spent much time examining it in detail. But the first thing I noticed was in the corner of the cemetery, there was about 100 German graves that were in the cemetery. They have a similar but distinct headstone, so they're instantly recognisable as German graves, and dating mostly from the Somme fighting in 1916. And the cemetery itself was right next to the civilian cemetery for the town of Jeancourt. And so it was fairly clear straight away why those German graves were there. This area was well behind German lines in 1916, so obviously there was a hospital here. This was on a convenient road junction, and so the Germans had established a field hospital in the town of Jeancourt. And then, as sadly as men died who were being treated in the field hospital, the sensible thing was obviously just to create a plot next to the civilian cemetery where those men could be buried. And so that was the start of the cemetery, Germans burying their own wounded who died in the field hospital. And then, of course, a lot of Australians and Brits and Canadians from 1918, when this area had been heavily fought over and captured in the advance, the 100 days that ended the First World War, so from September 1918 and that sort of era. But there's also, next to the German graves, there was a whole row of British soldiers from the Staffordshire Regiment who'd been killed on the 11th of April 1917. So I thought that's a bit of an odd one. The fighting at that time was around the town of Arras, way further north. So I thought that's an unusual collection of graves. I expected the 1916 burials. I expected the 1918 burials. But to see these April 1917 burials was really quite remarkable. And of course, 11th of April 1917, I thought to myself, well, that's the Battle of Bullecourt. Australians know that as the first Battle of Bullecourt. And so I looked it up, and sure enough, these were British soldiers who'd been killed fighting alongside the Australians during the first Battle of Bullecourt. So even though we remember the battles of Bullecourt as an Australian action, we should not forget there were British soldiers involved in both battles. And in fact, it was British soldiers that captured the village of Bullecourt during that tough fighting. And so these men were British men from the Staffordshire Regiment who had been wounded during that fighting for the village of Bullecourt while the Australians were fighting in the fields to the east of the village. And yeah, they'd been wounded fighting to capture the village and then captured by the Germans. And then sadly died the same day. And so usually when you see a battlefield or a hospital cemetery like this on the battlefields, the men who died in that being treated, usually they didn't linger for days and weeks. It was usually the same day that they died or within a day or so. And that was exactly what had happened here. So just remarkable. And I felt quite emotional standing there next to those Brits who had died alongside the Australians. And I've done a lot of work on the Battle of Bullecourt, the first battle in particular, and it's just such a terrible disaster. So many Australians killed and wounded, so many Australians taken prisoner. More Australians taken prisoner on that day, the 11th of April 1917, than on any other day of the war. And it was just really moving to stand there next to these Brits who died fighting alongside the Australians and had been buried by their enemies next to these German graves. So it was really quite extraordinary. So that was the cemetery. That was Jeancourt Cemetery. What a remarkable story it told. A story of wounded Germans dying in the field hospital, Brits who died at Bullecourt fighting alongside the Australians, and also, of course, Australians who died capturing the town in September 1918, made all the more special by that remarkable coincidence. So a really interesting cemetery and a fabulous addition to what was already a really great tour. Now, what were a few other things that were really special on the tour? And I should say that every day of the tour is pretty special. It's always great to be walking the battlefields and exploring the history of the Anzacs. But as I said, we do interesting things on the signature tour because basically I'm almost being selfish here. There's things I want to see on the battlefields, and when we go on this tour, it's like actually going with a group of friends and saying, well, why don't we go out and check out something new? So I'm always looking for new and interesting things to do on this tour that add extra dimensions, and there was a few things on this year's tour that really did that. The first thing was I was travelling with my son, Heath, my 16-year-old son, Heath, which was really remarkable. He has a really, his interest in history and battlefield history has really grown in recent years. And several months ago, he said to me Dad, I'd love to come on a tour with you one day and just see what you do. And through an unbelievable coincidence, this tour fell right in his school holidays. And so he came with me on the tour, which was great. As I said to him, you don't get anything for free. You're going to have to work on the tour. So it was great having Heath acting as a bit of a assistant tour manager, helping out with the running of the tour. But it was also really great to have a young person there. Heath's a good young bloke. He's 16. He's going to be captain of his school next year. He's a good kid, very smart and very personable. But it was a real privilege for me to see the battlefields through the eyes of a young person, because it's important in Australia that we that we celebrate how young people connect with the story of the Anzacs. And every time we go to Anzac Day, we see thousands and thousands of young people, wherever we are, whether it's in Australia or Gallipoli or the Western Front. There's always thousands of young people there, school students, lots of backpackers. It's a rite of passage if you're a backpacker to go to Gallipoli when you're travelling through Europe and Turkey. And I think we should always be really grateful how young people engage with the story of Anzac as a very broad generalisation. But here I got to see something very specific travelling with Heath, and just to see how he connected and which stories he found most interesting, and what parts of this story he related most to. Because, of course, many of the graves we were visiting were of blokes his age or not that much older. It's a little bit of a myth that the battlefields are full of 16-year-olds, the cemeteries. The average age is sort of early 20s. But still, there are 16-year-olds there. There are teenagers there. And I think even as a young bloke, Heath understood when he stood in front of the grave a 21 or a 22-year-old, what a sacrifice that was. So it was fascinating for me to see the battlefields through the eyes of the next generation. And Heath did us proud, I've got to say. As a young person, we should all be very proud of the job he did, because he laid a wreath at the Menin Gate on behalf of his school. He said the ode at the Menin Gate, the kahima, the ode at the end of the service at the Menin Gate. Heath was asked if he'd like to say that, so he did that very well. And it was great to see him relating to the other passengers on the tour. Again, just for the perspective of how generations view this history and how they can connect with it. And so for Heath, travelling with a bunch of people in their 50s and 60s and 70s, it was not the usual group of people he would hang out with, but he really engaged well with the passengers. He asked a lot of great questions. And at the end of the trip, when we'd finished and I said what was the most significant part, he said the connection with the other people was what he felt was the most important part. He really enjoyed hearing the stories from the people and about their relatives and about their connection with the history. And so what a great young bloke. I was very proud of him and having him on the tour. So that was certainly a highlight for me as his old dad to walk the ground with him. But there were a couple of other things on the battlefields that we did that were a little bit different than I've done in the past and were very interesting. One of the highlights for me was a place we went to on one of the days just as a bonus visit. It's a place called Bourdon German Cemetery on the Somme. I'd never even heard of it, let alone visited it. It's a World War II cemetery that contains 22,000 graves of Germans killed in the Second World War. And I've been to plenty of German World War II cemeteries. They're always quite unique. Everyone's different, and they're always very somber and tell an interesting story. But this one was absolutely amazing. So it's Bourdon German Cemetery. It's not far from Amiens if you're in the Somme. And even though that's a very an area of very heavy fighting from the First World War, this is a World War II cemetery. And in fact, this contains Germans who were killed pretty much all through northern France. So I think it stretches sort of from, obviously not Normandy, but it stretches from north of Normandy, from the sort of the Seine north all the way, I think including Belgium. Don't quote me on that one, but certainly way up into the north. It may include Belgium. I'm not quite sure about that, but certainly the entire Atlantic coast all through northern France. So it was made in the 60s, I think in about 67. This mass cemetery was built, and graves were brought in from smaller cemeteries all over northern France. And today it contains 22,000 graves. And what a bizarre and fascinating place. So we pulled up in the coach out the front, and the first thing is a sort of a long rectangular building with a big archway, which is the entrance. And I'm looking at this, and I said to Pete, I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but this looks like a concentration camp. It's that very blocky, imposing, intimidating Nazi architecture was the design. So I thought that was really weird when you walked in. And then I walked in, I went through the archway, and you walk through a little bit of a garden, and then there's a building, a sort of a round building. And this is the only way into the cemetery. You can't just wander in any other way. You've got to go this way. And you open this big, heavy door into this circular building. You walk in, and you're in a chamber. That's the only way to describe it. This sort of dark chamber with light sort of filtering in from the top. And facing you is this huge, scary statue of a grieving mother. And she's odd-looking, and she looks distraught, and she just looms over you on the far side of this room. And it's really disconcerting, I think, is the word. And I believe the architects were trying to do that. I think they were trying to do something which destabilizes you when you come in. I think they were deliberately trying to make this a bit uncomfortable, to make you sort of think about, I don't know, about loss and sacrifice. But you walk in and this looming sculpture of this mother standing over you with a hood over her head, and look up some pictures of it on the internet. It's really quite dramatic, this looming sculpture. So you walk in and then you go out a side door and then you're in the cemetery. And wow, what a location. It's on a hill overlooking the Somme River. It's absolutely stunning. I can't think of any Commonwealth cemetery that actually has a position this amazing. It's on this high hill overlooking the broad sweep of the Somme Valley with the river below. It's absolutely stunning. This is not an area we think of that has lots of rolling hills and valleys, but this one certainly is. And at the very far end is a big cross looking out over the river with some seating beneath it so you can sit and contemplate. And then between you and the cross is just thousands and thousands and thousands of headstones with all the German dead in this area. And so it's a very long walk. There's terraces on each side as you walk down towards the far end, and multiple burials in each grave, as is the standard way Germans bury their dead. And just a remarkable place. Very moving it was very, very moving. Look, I will say mixed emotions, because, you see all these young blokes, and interestingly, they had their birth date on the headstone and also their death date, so you could determine how old they were. And just a fascinating place. I will say mixed emotions. I think a lot of the people on the tour had mixed emotions, because on the face of it, it's all very sad. These are all very young men who died fighting for their country. And that's absolutely a way we should remember it at the end of the day. They're all just young blokes fighting for their country. But also, we can't overlook the fact these were the invaders. And many of the men in this cemetery would have done absolutely unspeakable things to the civilian population and to Jews and the whole thing. And I don't have any answer for this, but I think we should certainly ask the question, can we separate the two? If you died serving the Führer, trying to further the cause of Nazism in occupied Europe, I think, yes, we should feel sorry for you, but should we also remember that baggage that they carry? And many of the men in that cemetery, had they had their way, the people of Europe would have been oppressed for 1,000 years. That's what they were trying to do. That's the cause they died fighting to represent. So again, send me a note on Twitter or Facebook and tell me what you think. After 80 years, does it matter anymore what their ideology was? But it was interesting being in that cemetery, walking the ground and having those mixed emotions. I would get very sad when I'd see a young bloke, 19-year-old, who'd been killed in 1940. You get very sad. But then I thought, well, I don't know what he had done during his time in France in 1940. And that's the thing. They're buried in France. They're buried in the place that they invaded and occupied. So I don't have any answers to this almost impossible question, but it certainly makes you think when you walk the ground in places like this German cemetery. The other thing that I thought was fascinating was the dates on the headstones. So there were an awful lot of 1940 burials, as you would expect, when the Germans swept through France and captured France in 1940, and also a lot of 1944 burials when the Allies swept through this area and liberated France. So those you expect, and those make up the bulk of the cemetery, but also all the years of the war, from 1940 onwards, there were burials, 41, 42, 43. And when you think about it, that's for a whole host of reasons. These men could have died in training accidents. A very small number would have been killed by the resistance. I don't think that's too many, but it is possible that a very small number would have been killed by the French resistance. It wasn't a lot of resistance activity up in this area because we're quite a long way away from the action, but still, some of the people in the cemetery would have been killed by the resistance. Bombing would have been a big one. There were a lot of V1 weapons sites up here, V1 and V2, Hitler's vengeance weapons that were firing on London in 44 and 45. And so many of the men in this cemetery would have been killed in Allied bombing raids to destroy those facilities and other bombing raids. Amiens train station was very badly damaged, the rail yards, and it was almost destroyed in the Second World War in the lead up to D-Day. So again, people would have been killed who were in Amiens at the time it was bombed, or other towns that were bombed in the area. And as I said, it comes from a very large area of northern France, so there was a lot of bombing on these regions in the war. But also blokes who just died, in a car accident, or fell off a motorbike, or got sick, got pneumonia and died in a hospital. They're buried here as well. So really any reason that anyone died, they could have had a heart attack. So any reason anyone died during the war, they're still considered a military death, and they're in this military cemetery. But probably the most moving part, and I was a bit confused by it at first, was dates from the post-war years. This was confusing to me. Many dates from late 1945 into 1946. I think there was even at least a couple of 1947 burials I saw there, and I didn't understand that at all a long time after the war had ended. And I spoke to Pete Smith about it, and he explained what it was. It was mine clearances. So the Germans had obviously mined a vast portion of France as part of their defence. And when the French people came back, there were these German prisoners, and they said, well, you laid the mines, so you get rid of them. And so German soldiers were put to work removing minefields from northern France. And not given any specialist equipment, not given any specialist protective equipment. It was basically with a metal detector and a shovel, go out and clear the minefield. And a lot of men were killed doing that work. So a chapter we don't recognise, we probably don't want to think about too much, but putting German prisoners to work as labourers in this deadly work after the war. And that is something where I do feel a bit sorry for them, where you think that, you've done your hard time, served all through the war and survived, and then you're going to die in an accident, a mine clearing accident post-war. Just a real tragedy. All these sites tell a story of tragedy, and this was one. So it was a very moving place. I came away from it really glad I'd been there, but as I said, with lots of mixed emotions, and I would strongly encourage you to go there. Anytime you're on the Western Front, certainly go to a German cemetery. There's the big one, Langemark, in the Ypres salient that we usually go to on a tour. Fricourt in the heart of the Somme, where all the 1916 men are buried. But go to this one if you get the chance. It's Bourdon German Cemetery near Amiens. So just a really fascinating place. Some other highlights of the tour. I'm going to say the Menin Gate ceremony is always amazing. If you don't know what this is, it's in the town of Ypres, in the Ypres salient in Belgium. And after the war in 1927, they built the Menin Gate Memorial, which is both a victory arch and a memorial to the missing. And so it contains more than 50,000 names of missing soldiers from fighting in the salient. And every night at 8 p.m, they stop the traffic and play the last post. The fire brigade comes out and in bugle chorus plays the last post. And a short service is held under the Menin Gate, and it's always packed with people. Thousands of people turn up every night. Even in the depths of winter, if it's raining or snowing, you still get hundreds of people, and then on a nice evening like we had, you get thousands of people turning up, and people lay wreaths. And as I mentioned, my son Heath laid a wreath. We always get passengers on the tour to lay wreaths, and it's just a really special experience, and I've been going there for a long time now, but the interesting thing is Menin Gate has been undergoing some renovations over the last couple of years, and it's been absolutely covered in scaffolding, and the ceremony has not been held under the gate. It's been held in the street outside the gate. But only a few months ago, they removed enough of the scaffolding and have finished enough of the work that the service can now return under the gate. So you still can't read most of the names. They're still covered in scaffolding, but the service is now at least being held under the gate again, which is a wonderful thing. So a few people on the tour, we selected 3 passengers who had family members recorded on the gate, but sadly couldn't read their names because they were covered over with scaffolding. But those 3 people laid a wreath on behalf of their relatives on the gate, which is always a very moving thing. So the Last Post Association do a wonderful job. It's always something very special to participate in that service. So laying a wreath at the Menin Gate is always very, very special. It's certainly something we think is a highlight of the tour. Other highlights include Talbot House in the town of Popperinga in Belgium. And Talbot House was an everyman's club during the war, which meant that it was a place for rest and relaxation, and rank was not recognised there. So, every man from private to general could go there and relax and not worry about having to salute or be on or stand on ceremony. And the house has been preserved much as it was between 1915 and 1918. And so it's a really wonderful place. Simon Louagie, the director there, does a wonderful job. He's a good mate of mine. And we always enjoy going to Talbot House. And there's a wonderful museum that tells the story. And the house itself has been preserved. You can even stay in the house if you're visiting the Western Front independently. You can spend a night there. There's still accommodation there. And the Talbot House spawned the movement known as TOC-H, which is Talbot House, TH in military abbreviation was TOC-H. And after the war, the TOC-H charity began to take care of veterans. And we might not be as familiar with the name TOC-H as we were in previous years, simply for a very good reason. We no longer really need it anymore. There's less and less veterans now. And so thankfully there's less requirements for veterans to be taken care of by charitable institutions. So TOC-H has slowly diminished over the years. It still exists as a charity and it still does great work, but the need for it to be spread all across the world has reduced. In Australia, I can't remember how many, but I think some 100 outlets of TOC-H in the post-war years, especially after the Second World War as well. So there's a strong association with Talbot House. Tubby Clayton was the clergyman who started Talbot House, and he was actually born in Queensland. He moved to England when he was a young boy, but he is actually an Australian originally. So there is a very strong Australian connection. And I'm also very happy to say that Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours is now a supporter of Talbot House as well. So every time we book a passenger on the Western Front, a small portion of that tour cost goes to Talbot House as a donation. And so last year we helped renovate the chapel where a lot of soldiers had their last communion before going out into the battlefield. So we're very proud to be a supporter of Talbot House. And so if you come on a tour with us to the Western Front, know that you're contributing as well to the upkeep of the house, because it's just such an important institution, and we love taking our passengers there. We always have a wonderful time at Talbot House. So a shout out to Simon and all the people from Talbot House if you're listening to this podcast. Other highlights. I've got to say, it's a very well-visited site, but it's still very special to go there. The Sunken Lane near Beaumont-Hamel in the Somme, in the heart of the Somme 1916 battlefields. Now, this is not an Australian site. This is a British site from the 1st of July 1916, the first day on the Somme, but it's just such an important site to visit, and I really love going there. Australians, we can get a bit parochial. We can go and say, we just want to tell the Australian story. We get this at Gallipoli, we get this at the Western Front as well. Aussies say, well, I just want to know the Australian story. And that's why we are there, of course. We're all Australians. We don't have to apologise for that. But we also need context, and we have to understand that the Australians did not fight in isolation. And when we talk about a battle on the Western Front like Pozieres, for example, in July 1916, the most costly battle in Australian military history, that was fought as part of the Battle of the Somme. And so we have to tell the story of the Battle of the Somme, and you can't tell the story of the Battle of the Somme without understanding what happened to the poor old Brits on the first day, the 1st of July 1916. And this was the day that the greatest disaster in the history of the British Army, 60,000 men killed or wounded on the first day of fighting, the 1st of July 1916. So 40,000 wounded and 20,000 killed just on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. It's absolutely horrific. So when we visit the Somme 1916 battlefields, we don't just visit the Australian sites, we visit sites that tell that British story, because you have to understand what was going on to understand the context of why Australia was even there, fighting at places like Pozieres. And in fact, fighting at Fromelles, way up on the border of Belgium. It's a long way from the Somme, but the Aussies were fighting in Fromelles, the huge disaster of Fromelles. Gee, I'm telling a lot of stories of disasters, but sadly that's often the story you tell on the Western Front. But the Aussies were fighting at Fromelles in July 1916 because they were supporting the British who were fighting down on the Somme. So we go to a number of sites that tell the British story. They're all very close together. There's actually a loop you can do of the 1916 sites and visit the Australian and the British sites all together. But one of the places we go is a place called the Sunken Lane or the Sunken Road near the town of Beaumont-Hamel. Not to be confused, as a little tangent, not to be confused with the Australian Battle of Hamel in July 1918, the John Monash's great triumph. That village is actually called Le Hamel. So this village is called Hamel. There's a few Hamels in the region. And so the twin villages of Beaumont and Hamel, so we just refer to them as Beaumont-Hamel. And the most famous site in this area is the Newfoundland Memorial Park in Beaumont-Hamel, which is the preserved trenches and all the front line from the 1916 fighting. But not far from Beaumont-Hamel and the preserved trenches of the Newfoundland Memorial Park is the Sunken Road. And the Sunken Road was where it's very famous because it was in front of the British line, but the British sapped into it, and so this became the start line for a bunch of men, I think from Lancashire Fusiliers, who advanced from this spot. But the reason we know it so well is there was a cameraman with them, a guy called Geoffrey Mallins, filmed with a motion picture camera the men preparing to attack from this Sunken Lane on the morning of the battle, and it's absolutely just fascinating footage because the men are nervous, they're fiddling with their gear, they're obviously not happy to be filmed. And this was a time when cameras were a bit of a novelty, and normally you see First World War soldiers waving and "hello mum" every time a camera comes out. these blokes were not happy to be filmed, and the reason was they knew what was coming up. Soon after, within half an hour of this footage being taken, these men were going to advance out of the Sunken Lane, and sadly, most of them advanced to their deaths because they were absolutely wiped out by machine gun fire in this region. So you can stand there and see the footage, and I bring photos with me to show, what was filmed in the lane, to stand there in that spot, in the footsteps of those men, right where they were. It hasn't changed at all. You can stand right there knowing that soon after that footage was taken, the whistles blew, they advanced over the bank right in front of you and were mown down by machine gun fire. It's an extraordinary place. And Pete Smith does a wonderful job telling the story. And we also then walk to the end of the Sunken Lane and look out across the field on the opposite side of the road, and up on the ridge is a huge mine crater, and that footage was filmed as well. The famous footage you always see of a big mine going up during the First World War, that was filmed by Geoffrey Mallins from this spot as well. That's the Hawthorne Ridge mine crater. And then Mallins also filmed men advancing towards the crater and the descriptions of how they advanced, expecting just to stroll across and occupy the German trenches, and then the horror of realising the Germans were there and firing machine guns at them, and then watching them fall on this footage as they started to be killed. Just extraordinary. Probably the first proper combat footage that showed men being killed in action, legitimately killed as they were advancing, was filmed right in this spot. So, and it's unchanged. It's absolutely unchanged. It's really a place where you can touch and feel history, and it's so emotive to stand there. So even though it's not an Australian story, I think we're all human beings, and you can't help but feel absolute sorrow for the poor old Brits as they fought in this area, and of course the Germans who were killed when the mine exploded. So, yeah, a really important spot right in the centre of the Somme 1916 battlefields, and a place I always like to go to. Pete Smith is an absolutely extraordinary historian that I travel with. He's a great mate, but he's a fantastic historian. I always say on this tour, the two places that I feel the greatest connection with history, that Pete brings the history best to life, is Hill 60 in the Ypres salient, when he does his talk there about the terrible fighting at Hill 60, but also here at the Sunken Lane at Beaumont Hamel. So it's a real privilege to stand in those two places and hear Pete Smith bring this history to life. It's absolutely extraordinary, and I always feel very privileged when I'm there. Even though I'm leading the tour, even though I've heard the stories before, I always get a tear in my eye when Pete tells these amazing stories. If you want to know more about the Sunken Road, our other podcast, Battle Walks, where Pete and I describe walking the battlefields, we did a dedicated episode about the Sunken Road or the Sunken Lane. I can't remember which one we referred to it as in Battle Walks. It was either the first episode or one of the earliest episodes of our Battle Walks podcast. So look that up wherever you get your podcasts, and you can hear Pete and I talking specifically about this experience of being in the Sunken Lane. Those were the highlights of the signature tour. As I said, just a really great experience, a real privilege to travel with people and walk this ground. So thank you to everyone who came on the tour. I'm so lucky that I do this as my career. A war nerd like me, a history buff who gets not only to read and write books about this stuff and do podcasts like this one, but also to walk the ground with people and bring these stories to life. I'm incredibly privileged that I get to do that. So thank you to everyone who came on the tour and has been on tours with us all over the world. We really appreciate you sharing our passion to walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs. And if you've listened to this and enjoyed it and want to come with us, I am going to the Western Front next year in 2025. So my signature tour to Gallipoli, which is in May next year, is already sold out. But if you want to join me on the Western Front and walk in some of these places, just like the people did on the tour this year, you certainly can. It's departing the 30th of August, 2025 in Paris. It's a 9-day tour going to the same sites we went to on this tour. So there'll be some bonus ones as well that we didn't get to visit, I'm sure. We always like to mix it up on the tours, but I'd love to see you there. It's on sale now, the Matt McLachlan Signature Tour for 2025. I'll be accompanied once again by the one and only Pete Smith. It's going to be a wonderful experience, so I'd love to see you in Paris if you'd like to join me walking the ground. Thanks very much for listening. It's been great to give you this update. Do send me your comments about this, please. Contact me on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or X, as it's now known, thanks to Elon Musk. Contact me in all those places and just give me your feedback about walking the ground. Have you been to the Western Front? Tell me some of the sites that most appealed to you. And if you want to learn more about the tours that we operate and how you can walk this ground, go to battlefields.com.au, and we've got a full range of tours to the Western Front and Gallipoli and other places around the world. So there's always somewhere interesting to visit where the Anzacs have fought and died. So thank you for tuning in this week, and I will talk to you again next week. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.